It's hard for smokers to quit. Perhaps prescribing a drug to fight depression will work as well as the usual nicotine patch. Perhaps combining the patch and the drug will work better than either treatment alone. Here are the data from a randomized double-blind trial that compared 4 treatments. A success means that the subject did not smoke for a year following the beginning of the study. So here's our data, right? The nicotine patch, 244. There were 40 successes, right? The drug, there were 244 subjects and 74 successes. Patch plus the drug, 245 subjects and 87 were successes. And the placebo, 160 subjects and 25 were successes, right? So, part A, they want us to summarize the data in a two-way table. So I have that right here. So, we know for the successes for the nicotine patch, right, that was 40, right? And the total, right, was 244. So that means the number of failures was 204, right? So let's go back. The number of successes in the drug was 74. And the total was 244. So that means the number of failures was 170. Now for the patch plus drug, that's 87. Failure in the patch plus drug, or I guess the total was 245. So the number of failures would then be 158. Okay, so now we have the placebo, which the total was 160. And then let's see, the successes was 25. So that means the number in the failures was 135. So the total number of successes was 226. The total number of failures was 667. And the total number of subjects was 893. So this is what they mean by a two-way table. Now, part B, make a graph to compare the success rates for the 4 treatments and describe what you see. So part B, what we're going to do is we're going to write these percentages, right? So remember the successes for the nicotine patch was 40 out of, so successes, 40 out of 244, right? Which equals 0.1639. And then there were 204 failures out of 244, which was 0.8361. So now for the drug, there was 74 out of 244, right? Let me make sure. 74 out of the 244, yep. Which is the same thing as 0.3033. And the number of failures was 170 out of 244, which is 0.6967. All right, so the patch plus the drug was 87 out of 245. So 87 out of 245. And that's equal to 0.3551. And that means the number of failures was 158 out of 245. Oh, let me do a better job with that 245, which is equal to 0.6449. Okay, so now finally the placebo, I believe it was 25. Yeah, 25 out of 160. Which is equal to 0.15625. So that means this is going to be 135. The number of the percentage of failures out of 160 is going to be 0.84375. So based off of this, we can see the best success rate is with both the patch and the drug. So the patch and the drug, out of the success rates, it was 0.3551, right? So it also appears that the patch alone is not much better than the placebo. So look at that. The nicotine patch alone was about 16%, and the placebo was about 15.6%, right? So it doesn't look like those treatments are that much different from each other. So it does definitely look like the patch plus drug is going to be the best treatment option, but we got to do a little bit more analysis, right? But at least from this, we can see that. All right, so now part C, explain in words what the null hypothesis H naught P1 equals P2 equals P3 equals P4 says about the subject's smoking habits. So this null hypothesis, so the null hypothesis given says that each of the 4 treatments lead to the same probability of success, right? So there is no difference in the proportions, right, of success rates, which based off of this, we can see that that's highly unlikely, right? But we're still going to do a chi-squared to test this, right? So part D, find the expected counts if H naught is true and display them in a two-way table similar to the table of the observed counts. Okay, so here's the expected counts. So we have the 226 out of, what was it? So 226, so success, so 226, right? Out of the 893 were successes, right? 8, 9, what was it again? 893, right? So this is the expected, right? So we're expected 226 out of 893 times the number that were in that group, which was 244, right? So 244. So remember, this is the percent, or this is the expected value that we're supposed to have out of this group from this proportion, right? From the success proportion, which is 226 out of 893, right? So this is just the expected, and this is equal to 61.75. Now the drug is going to be, let's see, again, success, so it's going to be 226 again out of the 893. So 226 out of 893 times, and then what we're in this category, how many? 244 again, right? So 244, and that's equal to 61.75. Now patch plus drug, so that's 226 out of 893 times, so how many were in the patch plus the drug? 245, right? So 245, which is equal to 62, and then 226 out of 893 times, so how many were in the placebo? The placebo, there were 160. So 160, which is equal to 40.49. Now the failures, so the failures is going to be 667 out of the 893, right? So 667 out of 893 times, and then that's going to be the same 244, which is equal to 182.25. The next one's going to be 667. Well, let me do a better job at that 667 out of 893 times 244 again, right? Which is going to be equal to 182.25. And then 667 out of 893 times 245, which is equal to 183. And then finally, we have 667 out of 893 times 160, which is 119.51. All right, so these are expected for, so the nicotine patch, we would expect that 61.75 would be, participants would be successful, right? That they would go a year without smoking again. And these would be our expected counts for all of our treatments, right? Well, the success with the treatment and the failure with the treatment, right? So now, number 39, refer to exercise 37. Do the data provide convincing evidence of a difference in the effectiveness of the four treatments? Carry out an appropriate test at the alpha equals 0.05 significance level. So we want to perform a test of, so H naught, there is no difference in the smoking cessation rates of different treatments. And the alternate would be there is a difference in the smoking cessation. And we're testing this at the alpha equals 0.05 significance level. So the first thing is we should use a chi-squared test for homogeneity if the conditions are satisfied. So random, the data came from a randomized experiment. Large sample size, all expected values were at least 5 in 11.37D. So remember our expected counts, all of them are greater than or equal to 5, so we have a large enough sample size, right? And independent, since this was an experiment, a double-blinded experiment, it should be independent, right? So due to random assignment, these four groups of subjects can be viewed as independent. Individual observations in each group should also be independent. Knowing whether one person quits smoking gives no information about any other subject smoking status, because it's a double-blind test, right? So all conditions are met in order for us to do this chi-squared statistics test, right? So let's go ahead and do our test statistic. So we have to go all the way back up here. So it's going to be, so the actual is 40, right? So it's 40 minus, so the expected was, I believe, 61.75, right? So 61.75 squared all over 61.75 plus, and then the next one was 74 minus 61.75 squared over 61.75 plus, the next one was 87 minus, what was the expected? It was 87 minus, let's see, 87 minus 62. 62 squared over 62 plus 25 minus 40.49 squared over 40.49 plus, okay, now we got to go, so these are our successes going down, right? So the successes, now the failures. So 204, so that's the expected. I mean, that's not the expected, that's the actual, right? So 204 minus, so the expected, let's go here, the expected is 182.25. So 182.25 over 182.25 plus, the next one is 170 minus 182.25 squared over 182.25 plus, now the next one, so that would be the third, so 158 minus, so the expected is, for the third, 183 squared over 183, and then finally, what was the success here? Failure, sorry, failure, 135, so the actual was 135 minus the expected, which is 119.51 over 119.51. And if you plug that into a calculator, you should get 34.95 around, right? So the degrees of freedom, the way that we calculate this is we do the number of treatments, right? So there's 4 treatments, a minus 1 times the number of columns minus 1. So it's going to be the number of rows, which was 4 minus 1, times the number of columns, which is 2 minus 1, which is going to give us 3. So let's go ahead and go to our table. So our chi-squared is 34.95 with a degree of freedom of 3. Okay, so degree of freedom of 3. So we can see that it's going to be less than 0.0005. So our p-value, let me scoot down a little here. Our p-value is less than 0.0005, which is, of course, less than 0.05, which is our alpha, right? So, since the p-value is less than alpha, which is 0.05, we reject H naught and conclude that the smoking cessation rate is different for at least one of the 4 treatments, right? So now that we've come to the conclusion that the proportions aren't the same, right? We're going to do a follow-up analysis, right? So we're going to perform a follow-up analysis of the test in exercise 39 by finding the individual components of the chi-squared statistic, which cells contributed most to the final result. So the statistic breakdown into individual components is as follows. So chi-squared is equal to 7.66. So that's this guy here, plus 2.43, which is this guy here. Plus 10.08 plus 5.93 all the way there. So as you can see, the largest component of this equation comes from those who had success using both the patch and the drug. So that's this one here. Remember, that's the third one in our, so 1, 2, 3. So that's this here. And that is, of course, well, right here, 1, 2, 3. So that's the patch plus the drug. And we can just look at it, right? From our chi-squared. The patch, see, there's significantly more in the actual sample versus the expectation of those, right? So in our follow-up analysis, we can see that the largest component from those who had success using both the patch and the drug. Far more people fell into this group than would have been expected, right? 87 fell into the group, and we only expected 62. So that's why it gave us this huge number here, right? The next largest component comes from those who had success using just the patch. So just the patch is the first one here, right? Let's double check to see if that's the first one. Yeah, nicotine patch, right? The first one, success. But we can see from our chi-squared that this is significantly lower than what's expected, right? The number in this group was significantly lower than what we would have expected. So, success using just the patch, far fewer were in this group than would have been expected. This means that the patch alone is not all that helpful, but the patch in combination with the drug is a good treatment.